right, awesome. So, welcome to this, my first long form interview. The goal of this is always to empower the superpowers of the now and future leader, especially those who have been historically disempowered. So, minorities, women, creatives, artists, anyone who's had extra roadblocks to empowering their vision and pursuing their superpower. And there is no one better that I can think of to highlight for my first interview, especially since this is someone local to my community in honor of Black history, than Dr. Frank Clark. Dr. Clark is a local psychiatrist and poet, author, husband, father, community leader. And one of the purposes of this channel is to give a voice to those people who can disseminate their knowledge to empower the rest of us. And Dr. Clark has a few different creative works that we'll talk about tonight. As I said, he's a poet, he's an author. So I have here the other side, which we'll get into. Thank you for this. And there's a couple of other books by Dr. Clark. The one that we're going to talk about tonight is the Positively Haiku. As I understand, there's two of these, correct?
That is correct.
Awesome. Awesome. So we'll start with, I would just like for you to tell us a little bit more about yourself and help us understand more about your creative journey.
Well, thank you first, Cheyenne, for the opportunity to come on and fellowship with you tonight. And I'm hopeful and prayerful that many of your listeners will find this to be a fruitful discussion. But a little bit about me. I am originally from Chicago. I grew up on the south side of Chicago, and I did the majority of my education took place in Illinois, with the exception of doing my residency in psychiatry in Columbia, South Carolina, from 2010 to 2014. I've lived in various states, which include Wisconsin, where I did boarding school the last 2 years of my high school career. And I've also lived in Virginia, and that is where I took my first job out of residency. And they say Virginia is for lovers, which I would agree with, because that's where I met my better half, Dr. Jennifer Clark, and we lived there for several years. And we decided to return to the Palmetto State, given that we both love Greenville and have been here now for 7 years. I enjoy patient care. I enjoy just being with people and fellowshipping. I think that is very important, whether it be at the bedside or just in the community at large. As you mentioned, I am a poet. That brings me a lot of joy, purpose, and meaning. I am a husband to my lovely wife of going on 10 years, upcoming 10-year anniversary in November. And last but certainly not least, I am a father to our darling daughter who just fills my heart with joy each and every day.
Thank you, Dr. Clark. Thank you for sharing your heart, and thank you for sharing your poetry. And I want to dive deeper into understanding what it was like for you to go from that first creative inspiration. It could have been when you were a child or sometime in school, or during that process of becoming a doctor, and what it was like for you to eventually realize being a published author and seeing that creativity in the flesh. We've been told in the past, and maybe this is kind of dying out, but especially more Gen X, older millennials, we were kind of taught that the science, the analytical people are different than the creatives. And I think now we know better. What was that like for you in your life to be becoming a very scientific person and a doctor, and also having that creativity to kind of listen to as well?
I appreciate that question. For me, it goes back to why I wanted to pursue medicine in the first place. As you mentioned, there is a marriage between the analytical side and the creative side. And so one of the words that I always think is important to think about for any of us in our careers is intersectionality. We know that there's a lot of overlap between the humanities and medicine. And in my personal opinion, the two cannot exist in silos. I think in the past, it's been, okay, you just talk about the analytics and you don't get into the frou-frou creativity. Well, I think we were not created that way. We were created to be creative beings and to utilize our gifts that God has given us. And so for me, I think back to my upbringing where I had early exposure to the arts and humanities. I grew up dancing in various forms of dancing, modern, tap, ballet, and jazz. I was exposed to what it means to be a musician and to have a affinity and passion for the instrumentation, for what composers can do, and how how music is that universal love language that we can all experience, no matter where we come from, no matter our culture, our creed, what have you. So when people ask me, what made me pursue a career as a physician in medicine, for me, it was the love of the human body. Simultaneously, my love for humanity and the love for the narrative. And I think no matter what creative pursuits that we explore, whether it be being a painter or a musician or a vocalist or a poet, if we think about the human body, it is a work of art, in my opinion. Mm. So if we think about the human body as a work of art, wouldn't we want to analyze that work of art? Wouldn't we want to sit back and look at it like a Picasso or a Monet or a Van Gogh, for example? So that's how I think about medicine. And that's how I think about my patients. My patients are works of art. And so if we can think about, because all of us are patients, if we can think about ourselves as works of art that are constantly evolving, that are constantly being refined, then that's a beautiful marriage, as you so put it.
Wow. That is beautiful. Thank you for that. I love that. As a painter, I was listening to you illustrated in that way. And as a painter, that hit me in a new way. Thank you. Yeah. So tell me more about, were you always a creative, or was there a moment in time that you first noticed it and started to listen to it, or was it just always there?
So I would say that I've always probably been a creative. I just didn't tap into that early on. And what I mean by that is I'm specifically referring to poetry. Sometimes I think we start to tap into our creativity when we are in our, so to speak, wildernesses of life. And so my wilderness of life came when I was prior to going into medical school. And that was when I was diagnosed with clinical depression. And for me, that has been a blessing. And I'll tell you why. So not that I would wish depression on anyone or any type of medical condition, but I think suffering has a way of teaching us how to live, how to persevere, how to endure. So when affliction hits us, and affliction, and I don't use that word in a pejorative sense, but when suffering, maybe a better word to use, when suffering hits us, what do we do with that? Do we lean into it, or do we avoid? Now, I have done both throughout my life. Early on in my 20s, and probably even in my childhood, I was depressed in retrospect. I was an anxious kid, but there was such a stigma when it came to mental health in my community, that being the Black community. And I definitely could have benefited from therapy. I could have benefited from a medication, probably both. But it's easy to say the shoulds and the coulds. So I'm not going to blame my mother for that because she was going through her own trauma, her own depression. And I believe that our parents, that they do the best that they can with the resources that they have. And culture means a lot. And so I'm not going to place blame on anyone. I'm not going to even place blame on myself. One can maybe say, well, you could have advocated, but as a child, you only have, somewhat of a small voice, especially if you grew up in the era that we grew up in, where you were to just listen and you were to be seen, but not to be heard, is how I would describe my childhood in some ways. But as a almost 44-year-old man, I can't change the past, but I can move forward and say, okay, well, now I'm in control of my destiny, so to speak. I'm in control of, what control do I have? What is that internal locus control that I have, right? So in my late 20s and early 30s, I started to lean in more into the suffering. And I had no other choice because med school knocked me on my feet, or knocked me on my head, so to speak. I kind of got one of those Mike Tyson knockouts. And when you get knocked out, you either have to stand up and shake it off and get back into the ring, or you fold and say, I'm just maybe going to sit this one out. I chose to get back up into the ring. Now, I will tell you that in medical school, I took many knockouts that really tested my faith as a Christian, that tested my perseverance, that tested my resilience and my endurance. But one of the things that was always, and still to this day, has been ingrained in me by my mother, who is a retired Chicago public school teacher, is that you never give up. And I come from a long line of family members who have endured. My ancestors endured things that I will never quite understand or even comprehend, right? When we think about slavery and other things that have gone on in our history. But my mother, it took her 3 attempts to pass her teacher's exam, So I look at her and I look at her endurance, right? So when you have a model, you have no other choice but to get back into the ring, because I believe in that generational model. Intergenerational trauma is a real thing, but I think intergenerational resilience is equally important.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I have a model that says you can do this as well, I leaned into the depression. And so how did I lean into it? Yes, therapy and medications, absolutely, but poetry. I had to get back to what were the things that kept me going prior to medical school, creative aspects. And so I started writing poetry. And that's how the other side, my first book of collection of poems, I wasn't going to self-publish that at all. But it was at the encouragement. I was encouraged by some of my classmates that said, why don't you publish this? And I'll admit at the time, I was very vulnerable. And with vulnerability, you have to be very mindful of bearing yourself naked on stage. But I took a risk. And the poetry was this for me to just have that therapeutic release of the pain and the anger and the sadness that I felt, not just during medical school. I kind of felt like a little lost sheep. And I probably felt that way for many years, even prior to that, even during my childhood. I had those what we call adverse childhood experiences, those experiences that happen prior to 18 that we know can impact a person's overall health. And I just leaned in, I started writing, and I haven't looked back since.
You said you said to lean into the depression and that poetry was how you did that. Um, what can you say as a creative and as a doctor um, about the value of creativity and how that actually works for people when they lean into their creativity in the times that you said when you took some major knockouts?
Absolutely. So we know that creativity can boost self-confidence. We know that creativity helps boost those chemicals that are in our brain and throughout our body, serotonin and dopamine. We know that creativity can foster connection. The studies have shown that. There's a plethora of research to show that creativity, even during times of pandemic, that's when I really leaned in. And I wasn't feeling depressed at that time, but I was feeling lonely,
Mm-hmm.
like many other people, I'm sure. I was feeling socially isolated, like many of our fellow colleagues and peers. So, what I have found for myself and for my patients is that when we can lean into what brings us meaning and purpose, no matter what comes our way, we still have those as our anchors. And so for me, and I don't know if this is true for everyone, but for me, poetry is one of my anchors. Okay. Family is one of my anchors. Faith is one of my anchors. So what anchors us when the boat starts to sway? What anchors us when the winds kind of take out our sails? What anchors us when we have a virus that is virulent to the point where millions of people have died? Mm. What is our anchor when we have continued polarization in our country, not just our country, globally? So that's how I look at creativity, even everything that's going on now in our world. People are anxious, people are depressed, people are wondering, how are we going to move forward given the state of our country? And so, in my mind, I'm going to lean into my creativity. That doesn't mean that I don't have frustrations at times or that I can't lament about other things that are bothering me, but I choose to address it with my pen. And I believe that the arts will save us. The reason I believe that the arts will save us because the arts don't have this dichotomy of black and white. There's no dichotomy. When you look at a painting, there's, I know these terms are, we're not supposed to be discussing these, but I'm going to use these terms. There's diversity in the arts. There is inclusion in the arts. No artist just paints with one color. No poet just reads his or her one poet, like this focuses on one poet. I like Langston Hughes, but I also read Mary Oliver and Rumi, right? In order to cultivate your craft, you have to study various people who have come before you. There's inclusion in that, and there's equity in that. So as much as we are polarized right now, as much as people are in a frenzy, I think if we can lean into the arts, because music knows no boundaries, art knows no boundaries. And I believe if we can lean into the arts, then we can start to have conversations and get away from labels, Republican, Democrat, Independent. Mm. Because at the end of the day, I am still optimistic. Do I believe that we are in need of healing as Americans? Absolutely. And I think the arts can do that. Do I think that we are in need of reconciliation? Yes. Do I think we are in need of repentance? Yes. But I am so tired of hearing I feel like we're playing a tug of war with ourselves, and that's depressing. Instead of pulling on one side, we're fighting against each other. And for me, I like to take a step back and think about, okay, what is my part in this? I don't have to agree with your point of view. I don't have to agree with your perspective, but I can have a conversation with you, right? I can love you. I don't hate anybody. And for me, again, I go back to the arts. I go back to my anchors, whether that be for my self-worth, my wellness, but for the wellness of others. So if all of us could anchor ourselves with, for some that might not be faith, and I understand that, but for me, faith, family, and fervor have been my anchors. And that fervor, if I were to put that fervor as the umbrella, underneath that umbrella is the creativity.
Can I interpret that, what I heard you say, is something like commitment to that creativity?
Yes, yes. I think we have to be very intentional, and we have to be, when we are committed to ourselves, we can commit to other people. We talk about light and being light, and I think it was even Dr. King, right, that talked about, hate doesn't drive out hate. Only love can do that. Mm-hmm. Right. So if I love myself, then I can extend that love to you and to other people. But if I don't love myself, how can I extend love to you? If I don't see myself as light, how can I extend light to you? Darkness will feed off of darkness, but light will feed off of light. Right? There has to be a relationship, going back to this marriage, right? We can still be analytical, and we can and use critical thinking skills, but we can also simultaneously marry that with life experience. I don't know what it's like to be a white woman, just like I don't expect my friends to know what it's like to be a Black male. But if we lean into one another's experiences, I would imagine that would be a beautiful painting. I would imagine that beautiful poetry can come from that. And it's not about changing each other's minds, so to speak, but it's about seeing one another. It's about belonging. We all want to belong, and I believe we do belong as a part of God's greater kingdom. But even among God's greater kingdom, there's still jealousy, there's still pride, there's still power. And we know from centuries ago how that ended up for people. So what do we do in the present day? Do we continue to play the broken record that has been played and it continues to screech and scratch for some time? Or do we put a new record on and get maybe a new record player and start the dance over? And this dance, again, doesn't have to be, I agree with you dance. It could be, I agree to disagree with you. Mm-hmm. But you can still have a beautiful dance when two people are committed to one another in relationship. And that's what I believe poetry can do. That's what I believe the arts can do. They can put us into a relationship that we've never even fathomed. And if we think about each other as God's masterpieces, as God's poetry, we could accomplish a lot of things.
Incredible, Dr. Clark. Thank you for that. One thing that I heard you say as kind of a big picture of all that you just said was that loving ourselves is loving our community, and it has to be a two-way street. Is that fair?
Absolutely. I mean, right, you know as well as I do, Cheyenne, that no matter what type of relationship, right, whether it's a friendship or a working relationship or a more intimate relationship, there has to be reciprocity, right? There has to be reciprocity. And so relationships, to me, some of the best relationships that I have fostered over the years, especially in friendship, has been we are honest with one another, right? If you say something that I found hurtful, instead of this narrative now where we're saying, oh, people are just too sensitive. Well, that's invalidating, because what person hasn't been sensitive about things? All of us should raise our hand. If you were to ask someone, have you ever been overly sensitive? And if someone was like, oh, no, I've never been. No, I would say that that is, they're not being true to themselves. We've all been sensitive about things because we were born with feelings and emotions.
Mhm. Yeah,
So
we're human.
we're human. So I think we have to modify that language and say, okay, if you're bringing something to me and because we're friends and I value you, notice I'm using the word value. I value you and I respect you. If I value you and you respect me and vice versa, then I don't necessarily like using the word should, but
Mhm.
one would expect that there would be a mutual respect and mutual value where we could have an honest conversation and walk away still embracing one another. I've had conflicts with friends. Who hasn't? I've had conflicts in my marriage at times. No marriage is perfect. But again, what are our anchors? What are we
Mhm.
building? What are we building in our country, in our world? Right? We talk about legacy. What are the legacies that we want to leave our children? What type of art do we want to pour into them? What creativity do we want to pour into them? Every time that I meet a stranger or I'm fellowshipping, I like to use the word fellowship. That is one of my favorite words because it means something, right? Whether you're fellowshipping with somebody, a stranger at the airport, or you're fellowshipping with someone you've known for 20 years, there is always an opportunity to be light and to love. So, yes, we have to be committed to one another. Now, if that relationship goes sour, there could be many reasons for that. But I would rather be honest with someone and speak my truth and
Mhm.
hope that that would lead to more conversation than to pull back. It's about how we talk to one another, right? You are aware of that as well, right? As a coach, as a leader in your own respective field, it's not about what you say, but it's how you say it.
Yes.
And if we could
Mhm.
just pour into people using our mouths and controlling our tongues in a way that is shows love and still being honest, but direct with love, then we move the needle. Then there's not so much of this tug of war. There's more, I want to pull with you, come with me.
Mhm.
But right now, it's hard sometimes when we are fearful of the unknown, right? All of us. Uncertainty tends to breed fear. And when we
Mhm.
are uncertain, we start to make assumptions and we start to label and we start painting with those broad brushes. But there's a verse in scripture for me that is in the book of James that encourages James emboldens his readers to be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to anger. Even if you are not a person of faith, I think that is applicable, excuse me, to just life, no matter your faith or spirituality or what have you. I think it's just applicable to life. And that's something that I try to embody every day. I try to, even with my patients, just quick to listen, slow to speak, slow to anger.
What would you say to the younger generation as we have seen reports, and I won't generalize everyone. I think Gen Z is rocking things in ways that other generations can't compare to. But we also don't want to make too many comparisons, right? What I've heard is that Gen Z struggles with having conversations, even just basic conversations sometimes with their teachers, sharing with them, concerns or I misunderstood something. What would you say to people in general, especially the younger generation that has a gift and some type of creativity, and they struggle with those relationships, with those conversations, and they struggle with diving into their creativity? What would you say to them?
So I would say try to be your authentic self. And, for some people, they are very good with expressing their words out loud and feelings. For some, they do better by writing them. But I think it's important for people to get to know themselves. And I think we have to keep up with the generations. So, social media, I know a lot of people will communicate through social media. YouTube is another way that this generation has really been thriving and getting their information and other vehicles. But I think for the youth, this generation, I think it is important to tap into themselves. But again, I find that if people have not done that self exploration, then it's difficult to do that. But I think it can start with a pen and a piece of paper. I think sometimes, and I've had this with patients too, in the generation too, where they'll say, "Well, I don't like to write things down. I don't like journaling." Okay, you don't have to call it journaling. Just write down your thoughts. What's coming up for you? And I think we have to be very mindful as parents, as educators, as leaders, that how maybe we would express ourselves and how we were taught is going to be different with this generation. And so I think we have to lean in. Again, I'll go back to that, to lean into this generation. Oftentimes, I'm going to go back to how we talked about, we can make assumptions, and we're often wrong when we make those assumptions. So I think it's asking that young man or young lady or whoever it may be, what, how do you express yourself? What brings you meaning and purpose?
Mm-hmm.
We have to be curious, because I find that all of us are curious beings, even if we say we're not, but we all are curious. And I think if we are curious, then I think we're going to get more information. We're going to be able to draw more information from that person in learning what are their creative aspirations, what are their creative pursuits. But if we make the assumption, then we're going to be wrong. And it's just like there's different schools of thought of how people learn, right? Some people are kinetic learners. Some people, you can just open a book and they don't have to go to class, right? I wasn't that type of learner. I'm an auditory learner. I needed to hear what my professors were saying. I needed to take notes. But I'm also, over the years, I found that I'm very visual. I think it's the same can be applicable to the creative aspects. Okay. But I think it also takes us being intentional and being present with people, right? So, for example, if you're a teacher and you notice that one of your students, when they have time, a break, they just have a passion for doodling and they just start just doodling on the paper. Okay. Tap into that and say, I see you. You have a gift. How can we help cultivate that gift? Mm. Okay. So I'll use our own daughter as an example. She's very creative. Now, maybe that's, intergenerational, maybe there, there's some genetics there, but she is a creative being. She loves to draw. And so my wife and I, I'm going to give my wife her flowers. She's the one who came up with the idea and said, I think we should get her into art classes. And we did, right? Because we were curious and we were mindful and we paid attention. So I think we have to pay attention to what this generation is saying to us and what they're not saying. Mm-hmm. And you can't necessarily glean that from social media. But if you take the time to sit down with that up and coming leader and you take the time to ask questions, then that person feels seen, that person feels heard. And maybe the light goes off for them because they're like, oh, I didn't think I had this talent. But when you pour into people, right? Because people poured into us. No one has gotten, maybe that's an overarching generalization I'm going to make here, but the majority of people haven't gotten to be successful without someone pouring into them.
Well, it goes back to what you were saying about being a part of the community, and what affects one affects all, and vice versa, right?
Oh, absolutely. It takes a village, right? I mean, it takes a village to be creative. It takes a village we should want to see our up and coming youth. We should want to see them thrive, and we should do everything we can to make that happen. And it doesn't always have to be. I think a lot of times we get into this assumption that it has to be monetary. Now, monetary helps, but you can still pour into people without having money, or maybe you feel like, okay, I can't help this person because I don't have the funds that maybe someone else does. Okay, but you have this, and you have this, and to me, when you have this and this, that will always be more of a priority than the money. But thank God we have, and I'm going to go back to diversity. We all have gifts, and that's diversity. Some people have the gift of, they can help fund someone. They can help pay, raise money for someone who maybe doesn't have the resources for art classes, for example. Okay. While another person may not have the funds, but they say, you know what? I'm a connector. I'm a collaborator, and I can introduce you to person X or person Y or person Z. That's diversity. Mm-hmm. So there are ways to pour into people, but do we want to take the time to do that? There are ways to be inclusive, because I'll go back in God's kingdom, we are all artists. We don't have to be Michelangelos. We don't have to be Leonardo da Vinci's, but we are all artists. Painting with a different brush, pouring into the community, right? If you think about the garden, any garden, what is in that garden? It's not just hydrangeas and lilies, there are roses. There are different flowers growing in the garden. How does that happen? It's because the gardener understands what makes a beautiful garden. A beautiful garden is a work of art. And so if we imagine our youth as beautiful flowers of all backgrounds, and we pour into those flowers and we're not so much selective. I mean, we all have our favorites, right? But we can still have our favorites, but still cultivate all of the garden. Mm. Because if the roses bloom and the hydrangeas bloom and the lilies bloom, that's great for the gardener. That's great for the garden. And that's great for the artists of God's kingdom.
Leaning into your authentic self, leaning into your own creativity as teachers, parents, and leaders. When we are doing this, we are able to cultivate the same for the younger generation. And I want to say that I would say that this book in particular hit me as this is Positively Haiku 2. As I understand, there's obviously number 1. And is there another one?
There's 2 in that series. I have another children's book that I co-authored with my colleague, Dr. Zainab Javed, who I work closely with. We published a children's book of poetry called The Power to Act, and that encourages our youth, well, not just youth. I believe that my children's books are applicable for adults as well, but it encourages us to clothe ourselves with the things that we have been called to clothe ourselves with: honesty, kindness, grace, and mercy. And then my most recent book is Anticipating Growth, and that actually takes place in the garden. And it encourages readers to cultivate the garden for every season.
So, Dr. Clark, that's 6 books in total. Is that right?
Yes, with 1 on the way. So we will have 7 coming up in April.
So published author of 7 books, and your work has also been set to music, as I understand. Just to give a quick summary, a very broad perspective of your creative resume, let's say. Is there anything else that I've forgotten?
No, I appreciate you mentioning the collaborations with composers and vocalists who have worked on a global scale, who have set my poetry to music. And I'm very grateful for the opportunity to collaborate, to connect, and to meet fellow individuals who also have an affinity for being light and being love.
Mm. And Dr. Clark, that is exactly why I asked you on my channel. That is what this channel is here for, is to bolster those people who are already successful leaders so that they can pour into the next generation and to their own families, and for that next generation as well. And like I've said previously, I want to make this as free and available as possible to anyone. So I really appreciate your alignment in that. And I hope that in any way I can help get this beautiful work and others out there. I just want to go ahead and read. This is the last page, and I want you guys to go get this book and read the whole thing, because I am only giving you a very, very small taste of the beauty that's in here. But I want to share this because exactly what Dr. Clark just shared is being that light and leaving the world and the next generation with something life-giving. And that was what I found in this last section of Haiku 2, Positively Haiku 2, Peace, Love, and Discovery in 17 Syllables by Dr. Frank Clark, and illustrated by, I'm going to let you say this name.
Daria Panamarico.
Perfect.
And it also comes with music by my friend who is an award-winning composer. Her name is Nan Avant. You can scan the QR code on the in the inside cover, and it will take you to Nan's website where you can play the music while engaging with the book.
Perfect. Thank you for that as well, Dr. Clark, for that clarification. And where is the best place for anyone listening to find your work and support you?
Sure. So you can, all of my books are available on Amazon. If you want to support, there's a bookshop, I believe. You can find my books on, there's walmart.com, Barnes and Nobles. I also have a website as well, which I need to update, but it's drfrankclark.com, I believe.
So drfrankclark.com. We'll make sure that all of those links are in these descriptions on all the platforms. But I just want to share this last page of Positively Haiku 2. It says, the stars will align Light will outshine the darkness, strength for your journey. And I love that because of what I said earlier. It's so life-giving. And I know we didn't have much time to talk about Gen Z. I think we may want to revisit this again in the future. I have so enjoyed understanding more about your journey and your creative process and what you would like to leave the world. I'd like to ask you one more question and then I'll let you get back to your family, Dr. Clark.
Sure.
Let's say that Lost to the Sands of Time is all of your creative works, but there were some humans that were able to digest your work and leave a one-page, let's say, Wikipedia about you, and that's all that's left. What do you hope that page says?
I would hope that the page that it would speak to who I was as a husband, who would speak who it would that it would speak to who I was as a father, as a man of faith, and who I was as a physician. If I can leave this world knowing that I poured into people and that I did the best that I could every day to be a blessing to someone, but also have them be a blessing to me, again, that reciprocation, then I would say I've lived my life. Success for me is about seeing people thrive. Yes, we all have goals, and I continue to have goals. I think that is important as a leader. But when I take my final breath, I just want people to know that I cared about them, and that I was able to honor my wife, that I was able to honor my daughter, and that I just poured into people and I leaned into people. I hope people will always remember me for I wouldn't even say necessarily my medical expertise. I'm proud to be a physician, and it's been an honor and a privilege um, to continue to care for my patients and my community. But more importantly, I would hope that people will remember me equally for the enthusiasm that I carry, the passion that I embody, and the love that I give.
Beautiful, Dr. Clark. I really appreciate your time tonight, and I hope we can do it again soon.
I appreciate you, Cheyenne, and thank you for all that you're doing for the community and for continuing to be a blessing in so many people's lives.
Absolutely.